So we are still in our linear equation series, and this time we are going to do solving two-step equations with several fractions. By the time we get to this part, we already have done some abstract exercises on distributive property, solving multi-step linear equations, and then solving equations with fractional multiples of x. Again, we have our unit tiles, our xp's, and then our negative unit tiles, and then our fraction of x. And this time, we have a new addition to our materials. We have our fraction sets. Do you remember these in your work in elementary? Let's have 1/2 x plus 3/4 is equal to 1/2. What about this equation that's more challenging? It has lots of fractions in it, so we had to make sure we got common denominators before we combined. Then we had to multiply by 2 as well. Let's look at this equation with materials. Here we have our 1/2 of x plus 3/4 or 3/4. This is equivalent to 1/2. What would happen if we doubled both sides of the equations right now? What would we have? Say times 2, we get these. Let's combine our fraction sets as well as our fractions of x pieces. Here we have an x piece, and then we have 1/2 and 2/4. We have an equivalent equation, and we have fewer fractions now. Now, what could we multiply both sides so we no longer have halves, but a whole number there? What do you think? So here we have x, and then 1/2 is equivalent to 1/2. We can multiply it by 2. So again, let's double our equation. Let's examine our original equation once again. We have 1/2 x plus 3/4 is equal to 1/2. Here we have our 1/2 x piece, and then our 3/4 is equal to 1/2. We have an equivalent equation, and we have fewer fractions now. What could we multiply both sides so we no longer have halves but a whole number there? We can try multiplying it by 2 again. So double our equation. Let's put our fraction sets together. We're left with these. Now we don't have fractions anymore. We only get to see whole numbers. Right? Here we have 2 pieces of x. We have 3 wholes, equivalent to 2 wholes. Let's examine our original equation once again. We have 1/2 x plus 3/4 is equal to 1/2. So here we have our half fraction of x, and then we have our 3/4 equivalent to 1/2. What could we have multiplied to both sides to begin with so that all the fractions would become whole numbers? Yes, we could have multiplied both by 4. What is special about 4 for this equation? It is the common denominator for all the fractions. By multiplying by the common denominator on both sides, we will get whole numbers throughout. If we choose to do this first, the arithmetic used to solve the equation can become much simpler. Now let's look for the value of our x. So let's take away the whole numbers from each side. And then another, and we're left with nothing at the right side. What should we do? Let's apply what we have learned from our previous lessons. We can have a 0 pair at the right side. Anyway, with our 0 pair, we're just adding 0. So here we have our 0 pair. We have a positive 1/2 and then a negative 1/2. Let's take away our one whole fraction set from both sides so that we will be left with just x pieces. There. Again, what is the value of our x piece? So we can divide this into 2. There you go. So here we have x is equivalent to negative 1/2. So what did we do again? We have 1/2 x plus 3/4 is equal to 1/2 multiplied by 4. Then we have 4 over 2 x plus 12 over 4 is equal to 4 over 2. We're then left with 2x plus 3 is equal to 2. Find the inverse. We have minus 3 to both sides, and then we're left with 2x is equal to negative 1. Then divide it by 2. We now have x is equal to negative 1/2. I will show you another way of looking for the value of x. Again, we have 1/2 x plus 3/4 is equal to 1/2. Let's use the inverse of our fraction. So minus 3/4 minus 3/4 also to the other side. This is done so that we will be able to isolate our 1/2 x. So 3/4 minus 3/4, that's 0. And then 1/2 minus 3/4, we have to find our common denominator. Common denominator for 1/2 and 3/4 would be 4. So 1/2 becomes 2/4, and then 3/4 remains to be 3/4. 2/4 minus 3/4 will give us negative 1/4. Then we're left with 1/2 x is equal to negative 1/4. Now we just need to find our x. So what are we going to do with our 1/2? Multiply it by 2. We're still using the inverse method. 2 times negative 1/4 gives us negative 2/4, or simply negative 1/2. Again, we have solving two-step equations with several fractions. Let's work on the following equations.